Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Russ Miles. Based in Eastbourne, England, Russ is on a mission as an author, listener, speaker, and developer to help people thrive in one of the harshest and potentially impactful working environments, software system engineering with AI. He's doing this through habitat thinking, theory, and engineering. You can follow him on LinkedIn at Russ Miles and check out his Substack, A Software in Caridion. Russ is the author of the book, The Sovereign Engineer AI Literacy for Software Professionals. In the book, Russ writes about how AI magnifies whatever engineering discipline or lack of it already exists within an organization, exploring the concept of habitat engineering, the discipline that separates the engineers who thrive over the next decade from the ones who drown in their own AI-generated code. In this interview, we're going to talk about Russ's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience writing a book. So thank you very much, Russ, for being on the Leanpub podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for even providing any recognition to my hometown of Eastbourne.
And I should actually say a little programming note. You're actually in Berlin as we speak. You just gave a keynote at a conference, and you're taking time out of your evening and before the England game to talk to all of us. So there's a little time capsule for everyone. But yeah, so I always like to ask everyone about their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into the career you've built for yourself.
Oh, what a strange thing to cast my mind back that far. As anyone can tell, if they're looking at the video rather than the audio, I have the hairline of someone who has been around over a tremendous amount of time, and so my relationship, I suppose, which is probably on point for the book, my relationship with technology and with programming in particular began with a huge mistake. I spent an entire weekend, and I'm pretty sure my uncle won't be listening to this, but I spent an entire weekend coding in a magazine article for an
Wow.
Atari 600 or 800. I can't remember which one it was. And it was one of those ones where it was data line after data line after data line. And I diligently, obsessively, I suppose, it's about 7 year old at the time, maybe eight. I coded it all in. I typed it all in at the end of the weekend. I got ready to run it. It was a bit of a drum roll. My uncle came in the room to see what was going to happen. Of course, nothing worked. Nothing ran whatsoever. Would have been a minor miracle if it had. And apparently, you do need to tell new programmers, or in my case, just me, what the enter key does. Because what I'd done is spent 2 days typing in a line of code or
Uh-oh.
numbers and then pressing space until the cursor came round to the next line and then carried on typing. So it looked exactly like the magazine. However, of course, the keyboard buffer had been blown out of the water several times en route and nothing was going to work. I mean, that was forgetting any typos in it at all. But I realized, I think my father actually realized closest as well, that there was something in this for me because of the obsessive nature with which I engaged with it. And that extended into early computer games. I was obsessed about those as anything else. And yeah, I wouldn't say it was written in the stars because I didn't academically do great at first. So I didn't get through and the traditional routes into software engineering. I was told over and over again, you must have a degree to be a software engineer. I can honestly say, as someone who has 2 degrees in software engineering, I don't think either of them have really changed how I engineer software, but they have been helpful at times. And then I got my first big break in software engineering when I started working on the various avionics systems, actually for fast jets, for military jets. That was where I first entered the industry and wrote anything that probably ran and actually did anything of any use to anybody.
And yeah, so I've got one. I've actually you sort of brought up. You already answered a question that I actually often comes up on this podcast, which is in your case it'll be a little bit more detailed, I think, than most, but which is if you were starting out today with the intention of having a career, in software engineering, would you do a conventional full computer science degree or something equivalent at university?
My goodness, what a great question. Um, It's very tricky because it's answering two viewpoints, two perspectives. There's the what gets you the job, and then what gets you good at the job. And I think the what gets you the job is probably still a little bit of a tick box of if you've got a degree, it gets you past certain criteria, certain filtering. So I do think there's still a place from that angle. I also have the argument of that when you're doing the job well, most of what I've learned is good software engineering has come from working in teams of people that you don't do at university, or at least you didn't when I was there. And so that higher education didn't really prepare me for what it was like to be a practitioner. But what it did do, and it did it especially well at master's level. I don't know if there was a big difference really in every other degree, but certainly for me there was. As soon as I went to Oxford University and did my master's, there was a different treatment of it all. It suddenly became a lot more intense, a lot deeper, a lot more thought involved as to why we do the things we do. And that has been probably the most transferable set of skills and learnings across my entire career has been from that, and also learning why we do things generally. It's often the case that you, for example, you might adopt a certain practice like TDD, but why? What does it do for you? What is it giving you that other things wouldn't give you? Why is it applicable in some circumstances and not others? If you come away with, I guess we would call it a critical thinking mindset or something like that, whatever that gift was from my master's has been transferable to almost everything I've picked up since, which is I'm always curious at least of why am I doing these things that way? What has changed because of those things rather than just accepting them as being something that we do.
So one thing I wanted to talk about with respect to sort of, university education is getting your foot in the door. And I'll have a specific question about that in a moment. But before I get to that, one of the things that we would obviously see on the Leanpub side of things is very smart authors writing certain kinds of books on certain kinds of topics about AI. And one question I was looking forward to asking you about that is, so the sense I'm getting is that there are a lot of people who believe that the better you understand the fundamentals and the more time you've spent understanding them, the better you will be in the long run with the AI tools that have exploded onto the scene, and in the last like 7 months or so, in the form that they've taken, and going on in the next decade, as you talk about in your book. Do you think that's true? And do you think that that actually means that spending, like, if you have the opportunity to do so, a few years in deep study, even at the master's level when you're young, is kind of a very important thing to try to find time and the opportunity to do now if you want to have a career, both in software engineering and or in basically even management level now, because of what's available to people with these tools?
It's a really good question. I think anybody who says they know exactly what is going to be the things that we do as individuals in software engineering over the next decade would be lying. I think to say confidently we know exactly what we're going to do. What is more clear is the sorts of things humans can do well and can actually bring to the game of the collaborative game of software engineering that LLMs don't currently bring. Maybe fundamentally different AI architectures could bring some of these things, but certainly LLMs, there's cognitive differences between us that mean that there is something that we bring that is strong, powerful, and different from one another. So, whilst I think the foundational skills are something that have strong transferable value right now, the application of them, I think, will change over time. So, as an example, I know that I prefer to have test driven development style applications in code. You can see that even in my engagements with agents, I will ask them to write tests first. I will also try them to encourage them to object against their own code bases, to point out what is wrong. I wouldn't even prompt them to do that if I didn't have that foundational understanding. So I think it's easy to look at the workflow and go, how much code are you looking at? How much are you even caring about the internals of a code base now, or the internals of a software system?
Right.
And I've had interesting conversations with people who are saying, no, no, I think that's all going to go away. That's all going to disappear. Architecture is going to be important. Design will be important. Product specification will be important. Uh, Being able to distill specifications into the smallest validatable slice will be important. And I think all that's correct. What I think is interesting, though, is that there's a set of questions you ask when you have had that foundational knowledge, deep dip dive into these things that I think we forget we're asking those questions. I think we forget that we're bringing those perspectives to what we're doing anyway. As a good example, I suppose, I did an exercise some weeks ago with Alistair Coburn on his course. He did a course in Vienna, and it was all about how you slice an application and you apply the hexagonal architecture as a means of delivering those slices. And it was excellent stuff. It was one of those courses where you sit there and go, even after this many decades, Alistair is still challenging everyone in the room, which was wonderful to see. But the important thing I took away as well is when we came to the sample application, I built it using Claude. I had an agent group, I had my harness, I had my usual workflow. I didn't yet have the Carpaccio agent, which is one of the agents I've added into the AI literacy superpowers that gives you the slicing that Alistair does. It's one of Alistair's techniques. I couldn't call it the Alistair agent, that felt too egotistical. But the Carpaccio agent just worked. And so I didn't have that, but I could build very quickly the sample application that Alistair was asking us all to explore. The interesting thing I noticed is because I already knew the hexagonal architecture, because I already knew the boundaries of responsibilities across the architecture as it stood, because I already knew why things work that way and what benefits you get from that particular modularity mix, I could guide Claude very easily to create the right system. And better than that, I knew what I was looking at was good. I knew it was aligned with what we were looking for. The reason I mention it is that I was pairing with somebody who had just encountered the hexagonal architecture. And I was speeding my way through and retaining my cognitive grip on things. And he was actually turning around to me and saying, slow down. I don't know why we've got these pieces. I don't know what we've just done. And I sort of realized the benefit of those decades of experience and those deep dives back in university and those skills I picked up then of always asking why and being able to retain the whys of what you've encountered, that was why I could move that quick. And that actually dovetails with some of the features that I talk about in the book, and some of the features that I've delivered into the little AI literacy superpowers repo that I've created. Is a lot of those features are there to take the human with you. When you're using agentic workflows, particularly software engineering agentic workflows, one of the hardest things is retaining the human's decision-making power and ability. And because of the sort of skills that I've picked up through those deep dives into university and everything else, I could get a sense of where the decisions needed to be for humans to still stay in command, if you like, as I say, as the sovereign of the actions. And that means introducing friction. It means introducing the metaphor I've used since I've written the book actually is that it's the reason cars have brakes. Cars have brakes so we can go faster. It's the same thing when you've got agentic workflows. You introduce friction so that you can go faster. But we are responsible, and the agents can be held responsible for taking the humans with us and helping them continue to make the good decisions that an agent couldn't at the current technology sort of situation. They couldn't make those decisions well. So that's what we're there for. So yeah, long story, not very short at all.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So the next question I have about this, I said about getting your foot in the door, and this is with respect to kind of university education. I've interviewed quite a few Leanpub authors, particularly American ones who worked in kind of defense industries and things like that. And in those, there are kind of still, companies and industries where having having a university degree basically just might be a kind of requirement. I get the sense that that's kind of going away, even in those kind of highly regulated kind of staid industries. But there's another sense in which getting a university degree can get your foot in the door, which I experienced myself, and it's going to a brand name university. You and I were. It turns out we were at Oxford at the same time. I didn't
Oh,
know that until
wonderful.
I checked your LinkedIn before our interview, and my experience of that was coming from Saskatchewan in Canada. And I moved to London in 1999, and all of a sudden there was just like my way of putting it was like being a whale born in captivity, and all of a sudden I was like in the ocean, and it was like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be. I could go to I was going to lectures at the LSE at the Senate House. I was working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, but on my time off, I was like, the whole world is here talking about things, and it could be like scientists, it could be philosophers, it could be politicians, it could be renegades, and people were there. And Oxford was like that too. I mean, I could cross the street. What are you doing tonight? Well, after I go to the Bodleian, I'm gonna go across the street from where I live to see Noam Chomsky, and then I'm gonna go to my friend's poetry opening for their book, and then it's Burns night at college, so I've got to get my tuxedo out, you know, and
Yes. Yeah.
so like and that of course, like, and that was like just an opening up. I mean, it's an elitist place by design, but if you can get into places like that, the world that opens up for you if you're into it. Obviously, there's lots of people for whom none of that matters. They're like, I'm just going to, be in my hole working. I've got years to work on what I want and what I love, and that's what I'm going to be doing. But the opportunity to go to places like that could be transformative in other ways. What was your experience like in the early aughts
Oh, it was
at
wonderful.
university? Yeah.
It was absolutely wonderful. For many of the reasons you've mentioned there, really, and very few of them specifically for the modules I was working on or the content. It was this, you were left with this sense that everything is possible, and it's not even the privileged side of it, because I did not come from a privileged position into Oxford, I'm sad to say. I came from a relatively regular background. I think probably arguably I certainly wasn't poor, but I wasn't by any means rich. And I came in through getting a good first class honours degree, a regular degree, and then I was able to apply to Oxford. But what I learned at Oxford, and I think it's important to state it that way as well, is what I learned at Oxford wasn't software engineering, although that was definitely my master's. I learned what learning feels like. I learned how normal it is to learn, how the background beat of learning is intoxicating and advantageous and beautiful. And it's really informed the rest of my life in almost every single sense. I mean, I wrote this book because I don't think I could have proposed this book to a regular publisher and they would have understood where I was coming from. But I wrote it partly because of much of what I was taught at Oxford, which is, of course, you can write about philosophy in a software engineering. Software engineering, what do you think it is? It's thought stuff. Of course, you can talk about philosophy. Of course, you can talk about tango, the tango dance. Of course, you can put that in there. And I was always inspired by that. I suppose it's bohemian to some degree, but this sort of multidisciplinary, very little silos feeling that comes from being on a master's program, probably at many universities, but certainly at Oxford. And it really informed everything else I could do and bring to the game ever since, really.
That thanks for that great answer. I mean, I feel like the same way. And one of the very specific things to say about that is that Oxford has a college based system which, particularly North American kind of listeners might not be familiar with. But, typically, I mean, I think now, typically you kind of live in your primary association. The university is a collection of colleges. So as a student, your primary association there is with a college. Um, and the college is part of the university. It's a funny thing that I come from a modest background, also foreigner completely. So like, all a lot of it I learned on the ground as I was
Yeah.
going. But and typically as an undergraduate, you kind of live in your first year, and you might not in your second year, third year, and then you come back, I think, for your third year, typically, if you're doing an undergraduate degree. Graduate students often have a residence that they live in as well. But one of the amazing features of the college model is that your primary association is not with the university or the department, it's with the college, which means you're just around other people who are in this place to learn. And they're whatever they're studying. And you could be at your college bar, and there can be an atmospheric physicist to your right, and a kind of, I'm just going to draw on my own experience, someone working on, how the light patterns are going to work for the PS at the time, it's how old I am, the PS2, and next to someone who's working on, Isaiah Berlin, and next to someone who's, just played football with Bill Clinton or whatever, like it's
Yes.
it's amazing that way, that model. If you're into it, there's all kinds of personalities, but that very evocative description you gave of this is that learning is just is not in a touchy feely way. Not there's nothing wrong with being touchy feely, but like is an openness, a true
Yeah. It's
openness to
normal.
everything.
Very
It's
normal.
totally
Very,
normal. And again,
yeah.
that's what I was trying to get at too, about like being a sort of whale in captivity and finding yourself in the ocean. That it's just, there's nothing exceptional about just having a conversation about anything, or introducing anything into a conversation that you're having, even if it's a formal kind of paper or educational conversation or anything like that. So yeah, anyway, I just wanted to talk to you about that because I was very surprised to see that we were there at the same time. Um,
Yeah.
uh, Moving on to the last thing I want to ask you. So just sort of completely switching gears before we go on to talk about your book. One thing, obviously, you started doing at a certain point in your career was giving talks. You were, giving a keynote today. If people go to your website, they can find your events page and stuff like that. So that just because I know there are people listening who, they might be asking questions about their education and what they should do if they're, younger or maybe a little bit older. But then there's also questions about how do I get to be the kind of person who gets to be up on the stage, taking pictures of the crowd myself, for my own record. How did you get into talking at conferences?
So I was very lucky. I think everyone needs to start their sentences about how their career changes or embraces something new by saying they were probably very lucky. I was lucky and I was challenged. I was hired by a company called Interface 21, who then became Spring Source and worked on the Spring framework.
Mm,
And I think it's very fair to say, as slightly as a confession, that the least enjoyed job that we had at Spring Source was training. We had a bunch of consultants. We were all very experienced with Spring, and we were asked as part of our job to do a week's worth of training every so often, with public trainings or inside companies. Didn't really matter which. And it gives you an idea of just how attractive a job this was by the fact that we had to be encouraged to do it. There was actually bonuses that were applied to help people decide to do it. And I was one of those odd individuals that found he loved doing trainings and giving trainings. And even though it was 4 days of training, perhaps in the bowels of a building in Clerkenwell in London, I still loved doing it and got a kick out of it and loved watching people go on a journey with it. And I often think I should have been a teacher in some respects. I just think there's more money in software. So that's probably one of the decision making parts of it. But I found that I could speak on a topic for any duration of time. And as long as I led with curiosity, then people came with me. So that was how I cut my teeth, really, was by doing these courses to 20 people, 25 people. This was a real heyday of Spring at this point. There was a lot of people going on these courses. So you had like a mini event every time you did a course. And I would then deliver this material. I would talk through other people's slides, which is always fascinating as a challenge, and try and figure out what
Right.
stories to tell. And a lot of it was storytelling. I learned to take what was at times quite dry material. I think the very last module we had on day 4, I used to call it the killer module. It's the, people are already tired, and then we dropped Java, was it monitoring extension, JMX on people, and oh my goodness, is that the driest topic in the world? And so I used to come up with fun ways that I could tell that story of that content to try to keep people with me, to try to keep them interested at 4 p.m. on a Friday when they're looking at the weekend and thinking, my goodness, I'll be glad to get out in the sunshine again. So that was part of it. And that extended into public speaking. So I would do the usual evening events around London. I was very lucky that the training center I was at, which was called Skills Matter, it's sadly
Oh.
not there in its form anymore.
Hmm.
But yeah, Skills Matter was a wonderful incubator for my early forays into trying to do public speaking. And so I would do evening events there quite frequently, mostly Java and Spring related. And again, there's a lot to be learned from nobody turning up to a talk, as well as to lots of people. It happened both ways for me many times. And I suppose I just get a kick out of communicating these things and finding the stories within them. And that's how it grew from there. I think I made the leap into being a keynote speaker quite early. I think there was something in the style of the way I deliver talks that seemed to work. And I realized something fascinating, actually. I'd like to share this with people thinking about it as a path. The doing track talks, as we call them, which is when you see a normal talk where there may be multiple in parallel, they are usually quite information heavy sort of talks. You'll go in with lots to share, and you're trying to almost give a distilled version of something to people. Keynotes are weirdly just completely different almost on every single level. So in a keynote, you're trying to drive an aspiration. You're trying to lift people for the rest of the conference sometimes. And I found that enormously freeing
Hmm.
to be able to talk about lots of odd topics like philosophy and other bits. All these synthesis I picked up at Oxford, I was now able to synthesize into these keynotes. And that makes them much more interesting and fun for me to do. So, yeah, I think that's where I really started to enjoy it. I should also point out I'm an introvert and I don't look like it on stage. And I probably don't look like it generally speaking in life, but I certainly gain energy from not being around lots of people. My energy recouping is like I am right now in a hotel room. This is good for me after a keynote. Um, and that's just something I've learned to accept and work with. And I also realized that I think an awful lot of public speakers are introverted in some sense, and it actually makes them better speakers, I suspect. I've got no empirical evidence of this whatsoever, but I suspect it could work this way. So even if you're a relatively shy, introverted person, neurodiverse, you can do everything that you see on that stage. There's no difference between the person on the stage and you, other than a choice, a decision to get up there and say, I've got something to share. And just one last thing before I get out of the way on this.
Yeah.
Um, you don't, it's an interesting misunderstanding that I see a lot is that people think they have to get on stage and they have to deliver something that is canonically perfect and absolutely information on the ball, and that's what they have to share, right? But that's what you can get from books. You can get that from books and documentation, and now these days from agents. What none of those sources can do is tell your story. So, if you want to know what you want to talk about, it's you. What have you taken from that experience? And that's been a good guiding light for me. And whenever I'm feeling stuck and thinking, oh, they really need me to present, this table form of data from this particular product, I go, okay, what was my experience of doing this? What was hard? What was easy? What did I hate? What was I indifferent to? What did I fall in love with? And that's what you can bring to the stage.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. That's really great. I really liked the emphasis on yourself. I think that's one thing I've heard. I haven't done a lot of public speaking myself, but one thing I've done heard from interviewing people is that, you know, they'll often say one of the things I had to get over was being reluctant to talk about myself. People are there to watch you. It's funny, but people are there to listen to you. They're
Yeah.
specifically there for you. They want to hear
Yeah.
about
It's a
you. It's
talk.
not. It's a
It's
talk by you, and it's not. And
yeah.
so it gets one of those
Yeah.
things that's sort of so obvious once you say it that you feel silly for not having thought about it before. But they are. They do. They are. You just kind of have to like. It's kind of backwards getting over yourself. They want to.
Yeah.
They want to learn about you. They want to hear about you. They want to hear about how you and coupling that with a story and a
Yeah.
journey is particularly powerful as well because everyone who's seen the kind of Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock has heard about memory palaces and stuff like that for memorizing things, and there's various memory techniques. But one of the great things for a talk, which happens in time, is the model of a story, because you're going to
Yeah.
go that you will go down a tangent. People might interrupt you with questions, but if you're in the story, you're going to go, oh, where am I? Oh, right, that's where I am. And you'll know where to move on to
Yeah.
next, and people will be there with you, and they'll it's like the version of callbacks and stand up and stuff like that. Back to our story, like the stories are great structures. And speaking of structures, the next stage in our journey in this episode is moving on from talking about you to talking about your book.
Yeah.
And so the book is The Sovereign Engineer: AI Literacy for Software Professionals. So I was wondering if you could begin this segment by talking about the origin story of the book, when it first occurred to you, when your thinking first started, going along these lines, and then when you decided, it might be ready for a book.
So the book began as a different book. Is probably the start. And in fact, I think a lot of books start this way. I think you start by writing one thing and you go, that sucks, or it's not quite what I want to say. And so you end up writing something else. So I always tell people that when it comes to writing, whatever you're planning to write, be open to it not finishing, open to there being something else that grows out of it. And I had probably three candidate books that I was working on about 3 years ago. Um, and this is the one that's finally made its way to fruition. But to any given time, there were collections of pieces that could have gone into any of those three books. I can even tell you what those three books are. So there's obviously The Sovereign Engineer. There's also The Platform Curator. Not as jazzy a title, but it's about platform engineering. I could definitely come up with a better title than that. And the other one is it? Well, it hasn't even got a title. The other one is about metaphors. And I think it's the metaphors we build software by, or something along those lines, is sort of where its title's going. And they were all connected by the metaphors as a thread. Is that I felt a few years ago that we were at an inflection point, that software engineering was changing. This was very early doors. Even looking at LLMs at that point, I was looking at what AI could do, or what it was going to be able to do. I hoped it was going to be able to do. And I realized that most of our metaphors were going to struggle with that. Our mental models that are built upon those metaphors are really going to struggle. And so I started to explore why we had those metaphors. I just got curious. I let my curiosity drive me through it. And I came up with a bunch of different pieces that I wrote. And then I rediscovered about 600, I think it was in total, more than that really, but about 600 is a bigger number, of different ideas and notes that I made over the course of my career that I never really had any chance to write anything down on. And I decided, okay, let's start writing these and let's start sharing them on my blog. And you can see in the early days of my blog, I was just trying out different styles. I was writing Enchiridion entries where I was sharing something more formulaic along the lines of Epictetus. And then I was trying something else the next post, and bless them, anyone being a reader of those early blogs would have gone, I don't know what he's trying to write. I'm not even sure he knows what style he wants to write in. But he seems to be doing something here. So I had a few early readers come that way. And whilst uncovering all of these 600 odd different rough notes and ideas, I was talking on a regular basis with Kevlin Henney, who is one of those people I hold up as being an absolutely beautiful individual in our industry. not least because, and I want this to go as a shout out, if I may. Uh, when I got very ill with cancer, just under 5 years ago, he was one of the few that understood that staying in contact is really important. It's very difficult for folks to stay in contact with you when you're in those moments, but he was somebody that made time and said, you know, Russ, let's get on a call. Let's talk about something, anything. Let's go do that. And that meant the world. There were a lot of people that didn't pick the phone up, the virtual phone. And while I understand how difficult it is and why they didn't, there are some people who did. And they understood you don't have to say anything, you just have to say hello, and that person feels alive still, if you like. And so he did. And we were working through these things. We were fascinated by words anyway. I was learning Latin at the time. We were batting around ideas of the weirdnesses of language and the weirdnesses of the programming languages we have. And of course, that extended into metaphors and the oddity of metaphors. And it was Kevlin who first introduced me to Richard P. Gabriel's Patterns of Software book. And he said, look, you know, there's free copies of it, PDFs online. Grab one, have a look at that. And I did what every book geek does at that point, which is don't download the PDF. Just go and find some archaic copy in a secondhand online bookstore and order that instead for £30 or something ridiculous, because that's the weird person I am.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got it and I read it and I loved it. And it was obviously there's huge swathes of it that are related to object-oriented programming, which are relevant, but not as relevant as they used to be, particularly in my daily practice. But what was wonderful about it is that what leapt out was this idea of a habitat. And Kevin had already said to me that, yeah, that's the thing he thought I'd take away. I'd be in that place. And I was becoming a platform engineer at that time. And I had this perspective that platform engineering is not building just a product. It's building a place that people do work within. I always felt software engineering was a place. I went there and I had surrounded by the tools I use, the dashboards, the bits and pieces. And I wondered, wouldn't platform engineering be better framed as we're trying to curate a place for people to work well in? And that then led very neatly to Richard Gabriel's work and habitability of code bases, that sense, that property without a name from Christopher Alexander and the pattern language. And so that blew my mind again because I'd encountered that back in the patterns early days with the Gang of Four. And suddenly that was, again, another synthesis that came in. And I came back to this sort of distilled thread of what if we're trying to create a habitat? What if we call it a habitat? It's a place where we are inhabitants, and it's our relationship to tools that we can adjust. That's what platform engineering could be, is adjusting our relationship to the ecosystem of tools around us. And what does that mean when we're collaborating with other people? And, you know, what works well for the human brain in those circumstances? So those books started moving on that basis. And the one that moved the fastest, as I then started to tread the boards of using LLMs to write code in any sort of sense, was The Sovereign Engineer, which seemed to have found its moment. Again, I was completely led by curiosity. I didn't sit there and have a master plan. I certainly didn't have, I mean, I mentioned it earlier. I don't actually think I could have gone to a publisher and said, it's going to be this. I don't think I could do that easily until it was almost done. But yeah, it was very, I'm going to use that horrible phrase, it was very organic, but which it was. It's just that I ended up with 3 books worth of content and I ended up publishing 1 book.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that story. And I think it is definitely true that you know, most books, most book kind of like, you know, authors do have many ideas at the same time, and that things come, you know, kind of develop in their own way over time. And, you know, you end up going down one path more than the others. But they remain, the other kind of books remain there, maybe to be handled in the future. I would really look forward to your metaphor book. And if that ever happens, and what metaphor you use before the
It,
colon
it
in the
might.
before the colon in the
It,
title.
yeah, it might absolutely. It might be going in as a edition two on sovereign engineer. I'm at the moment. I'm starting to see enough reflection in it to go. Maybe there's a because at the moment there are stories told throughout the sovereign engineer, but they aren't connected stories. Whereas I think there might be an interesting idea of a connected story throughout. But I'll keep you up to date.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. So this concept of habitability that you brought up, you write about it very well in the book, where you talk about how um, is this the question to ask is this code a good place to live, not is it correct? Um,
Mm.
and to think about whether the people, I'm just quoting it here, who think about can the people who must understand it change it and grow it over years with comfort and confidence. And I really like the
Mm.
way that that takes into account you know concepts of correctness and truth and rightness with respect to kind of coding decisions often don't have this temporal element to them, in addition to the kind of the human, but like the just time someone's going to come back to this, and this is, I think, more common, but like people are going to be living with it moment to moment when they're engaging with it, and taking that into account is a really important thing. And one, so the next question I have, having discussed habitability to some extent, what is sovereignty then? What is the importance of sovereignty, and why did it make it into the title of the book?
So it made its way into the title very late. I should point this out. It was not where I started from. There was a property without a name that Christopher Alexander talks about, a property without a name when something is just feels right. Okay, so you're in something and it feels right. And I was asking myself, what is the property without a name for a software engineer, human software engineer, that is in an environment now that's populated by agents? That's, there are agents being able to conduct work that used to be extremely painful. Like a good example is today I shuffled a bunch of tickets in Azure DevOps from one level to another. If I was forced to do that with the UI of ADO, I would be tearing the minimal hair I have left out. But with Claude, I can say, please try to make sense of this sentence I'm about to say to you, but I want to move these tasks into subtasks under another task that is the parent of this task. Good luck. And it did a pretty good job. Okay, so that's a sweeter life for me, even though technically nothing has changed other than now I have tokens to throw at these problems, perhaps is another way of looking at it. um but yeah, the sovereign piece came very late because I was looking for this property without a name that is a way of feeling that you're still in charge. You're still accountable and responsible for the work you're doing. And it took a bit of a reminder from a few folks, but more recently from Alistair, actually. He reignited this a few weeks back. But this idea that software engineering isn't writing code. It's not even the nebulous idea of building solutions or shipping products or productivity. It's decisions. You're trying to curate a set of really good decisions over time. And I thought, okay, that makes sense to me. And then when you look at a platform and you're trying to tune the platform, you're not tuning it to write code. You're tuning it to so that somebody can make decisions that they can be held accountable for. And that started to flip me then to go, okay, well, who's the most accountable individual I'm aware of? And it would be somebody who was sovereign in their world, that sense of autonomy and empowerment and potential, power and potential. And I thought, okay, that's what I want a software engineer to feel. I want them to feel, whether they're working in a team or a small group of like one, two people or on their own, it's transferable. They should feel sovereign enough to feel accountable, responsible, and powerful, and empowered and autonomous to be able to do the sort of creative work of decision making that is software engineering. And that's how it all cascaded into one term. And I wasn't sure about it at all until, in fact, I wasn't sure about it till after I published it. And it was only when I hit publish and a few people came back and were very, very kind about the phrase that I thought, oh, okay, I can sort of buy into it now. Because you got to remember, I'm British. We've got a complicated relationship with a sovereign. We had our civil wars, by the way. They were a bit before yours, a bit before, and then we didn't have a king for a while. We had an interregnum where we didn't even have a king. So to say that we have we're not as complicated as the French, but we're pretty complicated. And to call that person sovereign and to hold that up as aspirational wasn't always that comfortable for me until I started getting feedback that people understood it immediately from the phrase. I was like, okay, well then that gives me enough to hang on to.
And so, yeah, no, that thanks very much for that. I should mention I'm Canadian. We've
Yes,
never
of
had
course.
we've never had a civil war. Although the closest we had to one was right, in the province where I'm from. But I would say, but yeah, we're. I think
But
there are
you have
probably a
got a
lot of
sovereign, I
there may
believe.
be, if there were Canadians listening to this, they may be surprised to hear that Britain actually had a civil war. But
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, on that note, so the sovereignty here is not as I think a lot of people coming to it, if they come through it through the AI category in the bookstore or whatever, they might think, oh, sovereign means sovereign over all the AIs and all the
Mm.
agents and stuff like that, and that's not what you're talking about.
No, there's two things that I think are really important when it comes to working with any additional cognitive system, artificial intelligence or whatever. Um, there has to be an accountable and responsible party. And if you're in some sort of creative endeavor, software engineering being one of them, then you're making decisions all the time, and it's decisions really that are the creativity. If I could extend it into other um, styles and media. So I'm a big fan of, well, I have been a big fan of Prince for a very long time, and just for his working style and very, I'm sad to see him gone, of course. But one of the things that he did was want to have control, creative control over what he's doing, and he fought long and hard for that. And I think it's being able to retain that control and literally sovereignty, so accountability and responsibility. Now, interestingly, in most legal systems, the accountable and responsible entity has to be human. So because that isn't going to change, and this is where I find it
Mm-hmm.
interesting when you have the
Mm-hmm.
vendors, and the vendors are going to remain nameless, but many of the vendors are from Redmond. The vendors are saying things like, you don't need junior devs anymore, or it's going to take the humans out of this or that, or the other. I always flinch. At best, I flinch. Other times, I rage at the screen when I hear that sort of thing, because it's not about replacement. It's about augmentation of their experience and helping them make better decisions, because they're the ones that are accountable and responsible. So this is why the term became so much better over time. It was like, okay, yeah, I get it now. And actually, there's a beautiful, I say beautiful, there's a complicated set of programs on the BBC. Again, I don't know who can access those, but we talk about these episodes explore the way that humans have developed relationships with AI and the sort of difficult things that have occurred from that. And one of the ones that I took away at the time I was writing the book was there was an individual where their AI girlfriend, which I think was ChatGPT, is the backing technology, their AI girlfriend had told them that it was a good idea to go and try and kill the queen with a crossbow in the grounds of her palace, which he tried. Now, the interesting thing was the conversation then with the police, because the question was, well, did you go and talk to OpenAI about this? And the answer was not really, no, because you can't hold a system accountable and responsible. You can only hold a person. And because they actually made the point that if another human had said what ChatGPT was saying, you would have had an accomplice on your hands. But because it wasn't a human, it couldn't be held to that particular bar, which I think tells you everything you need to know about why humans in software engineering is so critical, is that we are the accountable, responsible decision makers. The only debate is what decisions are we aware of and what ones are we able and comfortable to take on.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, that's definitely true, and that I think everyone who's been working with AI tools has had that experience where they're like in a meeting and they're like, but why did you do that? And you're like, well, Claude said so. And that you immediately realize that's not a good enough answer. And they're asking you, not Claude, that question for the very reasons that you're setting out now, that a person needs to be accountable and responsible within the system for how things work. Speaking of, there's AI girlfriends, and there's also kind of one thing you talk about is the confidence of the djinn in your book, and I was wondering if you could talk about that image, because I think this is something that very kind of personal kind of experience that people can have working with these kind of tools.
Yeah, it comes from some foundational understanding, I suppose. Again, it's always useful to go foundational. Back to our original points around Oxford,
Mm-hmm.
I went into the mechanics of how LLMs work, and it was very obvious how you can train and tune and weight an LLM to the point where it's sycophantic. And it turns out sycophantic LLMs are the most popular and also tend to be the ones that are used the most, just generally. And so that's on purpose. That's by design. It's going to tell you it's right, you're right, it's fine, it's good. And you also realize when you're working with LLMs, particularly on code bases, that an LLM is really good at reviewing its own work. It doesn't have our biases. It's sycophantic because that's how it's been tuned. But it isn't like human minds are blind to the work we create. We are our own worst reviewers. If anyone has tried to, and as I've tried to do, edit your own book, oh my goodness, is that hard work because you're fighting human brain. We are blind to our own problems when it comes to reading our own writing. An LLM isn't. An LLM can write you a piece of code, and in their very next prompt, you can say, "Could you look at this code and tell me what's wrong with it?" And it isn't just because there may be no memory between those two exchanges. It's also the fact that an LLM can give you the code and tell you what's wrong with it in one breath because it has none of the bias that we do. Not that bias. It has other biases, but not that one. So that sense of the djinn being a particular cognition that isn't good or bad. If you look in the sort of mythology of jinns, they aren't usually straightforward good or bad. They are complicated, a bit like Loki in Norse mythology. Very complicated character when it's not reduced to a Marvel comic. It's a complicated character, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with jinns. They're very powerful. They can do lots of things, but they are going to take you on your word. They're going to tell you you're right. Why would they tell you that you're wrong? You wouldn't like them if they did that. They're going to tell you whatever makes you feel good about what you're interacting them with, and they don't hold themselves to the same consequences or ethics or morals as we do. And I think that's really, to me, the djinn is always a good reminder. If I say genie to people, because I know that a few
Mm-hmm.
folks in the industry
Mm-hmm.
love calling them the genies, I always think of Robin Williams and a big blue, like, joking creature. And I was like, no, it's not what I've got.
Mm-hmm.
What I've got is something a little more malevolent than that. There's something that is extremely powerful. And if I get the wrong wording, it's going to be powerful in the wrong direction. That felt much more attuned. And I think I got djinn as a term from Salman Rushdie's work, a couple of his books. He talks about jinns. That was my introduction to this slightly, they're not malignant, they're not trying to hurt you, but they are there to do exactly what you say and tell you you're wonderful for saying it, and because they're not really accountable or responsible for anything they've just done.
When you have a section in your book, the answer to "Will AI replace me?" So I just wanted to ask you about that specific question because it's obviously the topic of the moment, but also I wanted to give people a flavor of the kind of, like we've talked at a high level, but about the kind of detailed discussions that you go into in the book.
Yeah. So the will AI replace me? That piece of the book, I debated a lot with a lot of people, because there is this sense of wouldn't you want it to replace you in some ways, in some aspects of your life, because LLMs don't think like us, because the cognition is so different than us. It isn't. There is no replace of jobs. The paths will be different. The journeys will be different. The type of work we do and where we apply our cognition will evolve, but it isn't going to be a departure from what the from our value, if that makes sense. There's a really important point I mentioned about reference frames in the book as well, where I say that our
Right.
cognitive reference frames are so different. We live in 3D space. We understand consequences. We have a drive to maintain our 3D body as we build a model of it. And I don't want to get too deeply into theoretical physics as to whether any of those things really exist or not. But spoiler, probably not. But our brain is inventing a very compelling situation for us to try and navigate. And through that, we have again a sense of consequence, a sense of community, a sense of real world factors that an LLM has none of. Even if you tell it the rules, the laws of the land, and the laws of physics, that doesn't mean it has the phenomenological experience that we have. And that's important when it comes to decision making. And it's important to understand our value in the mix.
Yeah, I think the really excellent image that you use is, the telescope will not replace the astronomer. And
Exactly.
it's very interesting. I can think of one particular guest we've had on the podcast before, Andrew Burkov, who's got a PhD in artificial intelligence, and works in that space for a long time. And one thing, he's got a very lively presence on social media and stuff like that. And one thing he keeps one's kind of sword he keeps kind of cleaving at social media posts with is their machines, their tools, their programmed tools and machines. Just try to keep that in mind, not a way as feeling better than them or belittling them or
No.
it's just they're just keep that in mind. If you want to be serious about the potential of what you've got before you, keep in mind that these are machines. And I think that's a really great answer to that question. Just moving on to the last part of the interview, where we talk about the guest's experience writing and as a writer. So you already brought up a little bit, the experience of having sort of 3 ideas that came up over time. One of them ended up being the path that you went down now, and the difficulty of editing yourself. So what was your when you kind of, did you realize you were writing a book, or did you decide you were writing a book? And what was your, because it's quite long, it's quite dense. It's very well structured. Did you settle on a process? Those are the kind of questions that I think people like to hear about. Were you a kind of weekend afternoons person? Were you a weekday evenings person for writing? Were you a coffee shop, airplane? What was your approach to writing the book?
Oh, my approach was terrible. But I'll confess it anyway. So in the early days of writing, I fell out of love with technology completely and wanted to write everything by hand on paper. I'd seen some wonderful interviews with various writers, trying to think of the name of the writer that I watched particularly do this. I think it was a gentleman that wrote The Northern Lights. Off the top of my head, I can't believe it's gone. Another Oxford person. But yes, watching how he wrote with a fountain pen or a biro at times, I was inspired. That's how real writing happens. And then I went to a poetry recital in Eastbourne, and it was absolutely eye-opening because there was I think every poet had a different way of capturing their poetry. There were some with bits of paper and pencils. There were those with expensive £500 pens. There was right through to someone with their phone, opening up notes and getting their stuff from that. And I thought, this is insane. I got really in love with the idea of a process being the answer. And so I'd gone very deeply into this.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that the insanity was I was starting to care about the process more than the actual writing. Excuse me. And so I abandoned all of that and started writing anywhere, anyhow. I used a brilliant app, which I will plug, called NotePlan. It syncs up my notes from my phone and my laptop and keeps everything working well. I can thank NotePlan not only for capturing the notes, capturing all the information I was going to share, but also helping with the structure that you very kindly referred to. Because without that ability to move things around, I would have been in a very difficult place indeed. So that was what unlocked it. I started to write very quickly that through NotePlan. NotePlan also is in Markdown, so I didn't
Oh,
have to think much about formatting. I stopped thinking formatting, but the jump to bring things over into your platform was very easy because I was already in Markdown to a certain degree. So it was a relatively trivial jump. And I guess the thing you mentioned there about did it come together as a book? It didn't really come together as a book until probably the last few months that I
okay.
started to see the book, and the glue was the stories that I was adding in. I was adding in these placeholder stories, like the tango is the early one,
Right.
and I could see it was weird. I couldn't see the acts as well as what they ended up being, but I could see the before and after the story a couple of times. And so they became the fences around the bits that were beginning to make sense. And then, to be honest, I had to do something which is incredibly painful to any sort of writer, is I had to put it all aside for about a month and come back and read it all again.
Mm.
And I find that the worst part. I wish I loved to edit. I know many writers who do. I do not. I much prefer to write and then forget. Um, in fact, my favorite quote is from a writer, Ray Bradbury. And he has a wonderful note. He talks about, he has a post-it note above his typewriter that it says, "Don't think." And I think that's a brilliant piece of advice, because when I'm writing, I'm not thinking. I'm just exploring a moment and trying to think, what would someone say at this point? And then try and explain it to either if I'm writing and I'm not writing dialogue, then I'm writing for somebody who's not there. I'm just saying it out to them like a monologue. But then if I've got dialogue, that's even better because I can play both sides of the arrangement. And yeah, it came together extremely intensely over the last month, where I was beginning to write on my blog the Le Bon Mot stories, where you've got, I always have this setting of a little fictional cafe where people are talking about stuff, and it's all very metaphorical. It's a habitat, so you get where I'm going with that. Um, and then that fed into the stories that could go into the book, and some of them kind of properly made it over, some of it did, some of them didn't. And I realized that I had a style. I had a style then that I was working with. And I'll be honest, I intentionally, over the last few weeks, 2 weeks probably, of writing the book, I went back and readdressed some of the style on it quite heavily, because I suddenly decided I wanted to write like Douglas Adams.
Ah,
I just I was compelled to write like that in any way I could. So I would tweak anything to try to make it sound a little more Douglas Adams if I could, and so I did. In some places, probably too much, but that was what. And I think I found that at least something that was joyful was to. Do you know what? It made editing palpable to me, palatable,
oh, I
because
see.
I could edit. I could
Yeah.
edit towards Douglas Adams, not
Yeah.
just edit my stuff. So yeah, there you go. That's sort of my process. I wish it was more rigorous. Wish it was more structured. Um, but I would say, if there's any advice in it at all, read anything by Ray Bradbury on how to write, because the gentleman was just off the charts in terms of realizing this isn't that serious. Both him and Kurt Vonnegut are the two that I fell in love with throughout this process, because Bradbury was full of great advice. Vonnegut was just full of irreverence.
Hmm.
And I loved both of them for that.
The last question I always ask the guest on the podcast, if they're a Leanpub author, is if there was one magical feature we could build for you, or if there was one thing that when you were working with Leanpub had you shaking your fist and yelling at the screen and going, "Damn you, Leanpub, this sucks. Why does this suck so bad?" that we could fix for you. Is there anything that you can think of that you would ask us to do?
I don't think there's much at all, because I think the platform is pretty perfect. I would love print on demand
Right.
directly out of the tool. Maybe it's there. I'm a print fan, so for me, Leanpub would be perfect if I could say, right, version 1 is done. Make that available in print. Make it available as a hardback. even leather bound. All right. Now you asked me for aspirations here,
Hmm.
right? So,
Hmm.
yeah,
Right.
I want my leather bound edition. It cost me £100 a copy to print
Right.
because it's literally that ridiculous.
Yeah.
I don't mind, and that's what I would love. That would be perfect. The only other thing that was always a bugbear for me, and I think it's possibly just my, I don't know, my mental limitations, but getting sizes of images right when you're
Uh,
working in Markdown has been a constant source of, what you do is you tweak, you then go and have a look at your preview,
right.
and you go, it's wrong again. And I'll go back and do it again. It doesn't take long to get things right, but there was still this element of ouch each time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was
Yeah.
it, really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks very much for sharing that. I mean, we've had the magical "get me a print" button kind of request before. We've had the idea ourselves. We've tried various approaches. The best, just for anyone listening, the best approach we have worked out so far to that is we have a print ready PDF button. So you can click
Mm.
one button and get the PDF that you need to go to Ingram Spark or Amazon KDP. They need you to give them basically a PDF. You can get that from your Leanpub manuscript. You will have to decide. You will have to learn about dimensions and make choices about stuff and stuff like that. But you really, once you've got your manuscript, it's just dimension choices basically after that, and you click a button and you get the print ready PDF that you need to go then onto those other platforms. We also have a kind of rather expensive, for because it's hard to use, publish on Amazon service for authors who are like, I've got I do have a budget for this. Here you go, Leanpub. You just take care of getting my book into print. We publish it on Amazon. We manage everything. We manage all the royalties and stuff like that. Your book will be in print. You'll get some copies from us, etc. Kind of thing. It's typically the way it works. But moving from you know bits to atoms, is is a whole different business.
Talk
And
to the embodied robotics people. It's pretty hard stuff.
exactly kind of thing. And and so maybe that's always there. That's always there as a lingering question. Will Leanpub ever have a button I can just click and I'll get my book? And that doesn't cost a lot of money.
Yeah, although
We,
I'd be happy to pay for it. You've got to
yeah, yeah,
remember, I'm that sort of book geek.
yeah, right, yeah, yeah. No, I meant for the service.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
there's definitely lots of people who, oh, they love, like, I mean, a print book is an amazing thing. I mean, I remember when my dad, first sort of seeing a book that my dad had written, kind of getting a hardback copy, and it's kind of like, oh my goodness, that's very different. And being able to give them to people, have them at conferences, stuff like that, is
yeah.
very amazing. So the need or demand for print books is a big one. Uh, so thanks for that. And
Just
yeah, when
on,
it comes to, sorry.
sorry, just on that point as well, right? So the one thing I didn't share, I just want to quickly share with you where
Sure.
the book was instigated, where my blog was instigated, and where Le Bon Mot came from. So all of the style that I use in my writing, yes, I was influenced by these writers, but I was absolutely ignited by finding a book in a secondhand bookshop. So it relates to our printing needs, or my printing needs. I found a book from 1578 in my local bookshop. There's 9 copies in the world that we know of, and 2 of which are in the Vatican. And I bought this little book from a secondhand bookshop called Camilla's Books in Eastbourne. If you're ever anyone near Eastbourne, go to Camilla's Books. It is a absolute public health hazard. It has a million books and it's lethal in there. If you have claustrophobia of any sort, do not go in this building. But it is wonderful. It's a treasure trove of books. And I found this book, a 470-year-old little book, and it's Epic TT Enchiridion, and that's where all of that came from, was just finding this tiny little book and wondering about. So when you think about the story of that book and the fact that it's found its way into my flat in Eastbourne, when it would have begun its life in Antwerp with Christophe Plantin being the printer of it, and its journey through, I mean, there would have been galleons, there would have been, this was
Right.
pre the creation of whole nations. It's a crazy story to think of this book in existence throughout all of that, which is where my love affair
Hmm.
with books was amplified, and the print book.
Yeah, I know that's a fascinating story. What an amazing find. And yeah, thinking about, I love that idea of the galleons and how it would have, gotten across the uh the channel and things like that.
Yeah,
Yeah, the various
yeah,
hands that it would have taken passed through until, and who knows how long it was there until the right person, and how many other people saw it, and some crappy old book, until the right person knew the kind of what they were looking at.
yeah,
And on that note, speaking of knowing what you're looking at, so yeah, with respect to the sort of very technical question about image sizing in books and stuff like that, so in Leanpub we don't, the only way to get to know what an image is going to look like in the ebook itself is by clicking the preview button in Leanpub and sort of generating the ebook from your manuscript and seeing. We've had the request for automatic instant previews many times before. It's possible that someday we will have something like that. It's kind of hard. Those kinds of things are kind of a little bit tricky from our perspective because we're so like, it's our business, right? So we're like the idea that like, yeah, you're going to, I mean, even when it comes to doing print books on, like, you don't know what it's going to look like until you actually print it.
yeah, of
Which is why
course.
you get test copies when you do print books. But we do know that like, like WYSIWYG and all that kind of stuff every people want to be able to know what it's going to look like, and they want to know they want to be able to click and drag something to change the image sizing rather than like
Yeah,
type in some kind of like kind of programmatic dimensions and then click a preview button and wait and go, oh damn it,
yeah,
it's just a little bit off, so I've got to do it again. So we recognize the need for that. We do have an image sizing advice kind of section in the Leanpub author app side of things for books and stuff like that, but that's also one of the things we get asked about from time to time. um and
just
I
to
think
give you
something.
very quickly on that, I've got a
Yeah.
little agent that does that now for
Oh,
me.
you
So
do? Oh, great.
yeah, I created an agent that will kick off a build, take the reduced PDF, do an analysis of it image wise, and go, yeah, I should change the dimensions slightly. So
Oh, that's
I
awesome. So you're
streamline my
using
process.
that's interesting. So you're using our API to do that.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
awesome. That totally makes sense. Oh, that's one of the things I love. I mean, I love talking about all the other stuff, but like getting to hear about what authors are doing that way is also amazing too. Well, Russ, thank you very much for taking some time to talk to all of us today from your evening in Berlin after giving a keynote talk on your book, The Sovereign Engineer: AI Literacy for Software Professionals. And thank you very much for talking about yourself and your story, and for using Leanpub as a platform for writing and publishing.
Thank you for providing it, and thank you for inviting me on.